Welcome. Thanks for coming in from the rain. We're definitely going to make it worth your while. This is our last event of the year and of the semester, and it's a wonderful way to end it. I was remembering in anticipation of this event how I met Peter. So, do you remember? No. So, you definitely don't remember, because here's what happened. It was at NYU, and I was just trying to figure out like who the best people were and who I wanted to talk to. So obviously Peter was at the top of the list. And I called him up and I'm like, I'm gonna start this center, you know, and it's gonna look at national security and civil liberties, and we're gonna be great and whatever. Do you wanna like meet me and talk to me and maybe help with our first event? And he said, no. I was like, what? So then we talked for about 10 more minutes or 20 more minutes, and he said, I'll be there tomorrow.
Okay, cool, that's good.
So that was good. And I have no idea what happened, but it was like, I remember that, sort of like, oh no, this is going to be a disaster. And that was what, 16, 17 years ago? That was a long time ago. And you have been the best colleague ever that I could ever imagine. So in addition to being a good colleague since then, he's written many, many books. And Peter's our go-to guy in the sort of national security conversation to tell us where we are, where we've come from, where we're going. He's held our hand from his earliest book on bin Laden, Holy War Incorporated, through Holy War Inc., I got it. And then through his continual books about Al-Qaeda, about bin Laden. And this book is a little bit of a redirection. It's not different, but it's pulling back the lens a little bit bigger. Not that you didn't talk about the national security establishment in a number of your books, but it was more as well as a way of telling the story, rather. Yeah. So I wanted to begin with a question about, which I don't think the answer is obvious, which is why, after writing about Afghanistan, as you did, and the war on terror, and bin Laden, and terrorism in the United States, why you decided to focus on the White House and the generals who, you know, whose input on the National Security Council was obviously important, but why?
You know, Rachel Clayman, who you know is edited one of your books and edited 3 of my books, said, why don't you write about Trump during the transition? And I said, that seems like a really good idea. And then Scott Moyers, my editor, bought the book at Penguin. You know, I mean, the transition, it was clear that Trump was going to be a consequential president, because this is the first president in American history who hadn't served in the military or served in public office. And clearly there was going to be an interesting story. And I, you know, frankly, you know, I've written 5 books before which focused on terrorism, and I was kind of terrorized out. I initially this book was going to be about ISIS and the campaign against ISIS, but over time I thought it'd be more interesting to kind of open the aperture a bit and write about this team of generals at the beginning of the Trump administration. And you know, if Hillary Clinton had won, I probably would have had less access to, it would have been a more disciplined administration, like the Obama administration. And because I've been reporting on the military for about a decade and a half in a fairly comprehensive way, you know, I kind of knew a lot of people. And of course that helps when you're writing a book. So that's kind of why I decided to write it. You know, it's now almost 3 years later. Writing a book is a lot of work. I was saying to Jen Easterly here that, you know, there's a lot of missed weekends, a lot of missed vacations, as you know. It's not an easy task. I talked to about 100 people for the book, some of whom I interviewed on multiple occasions. I recorded almost all the interviews, so and checked, and I usually cleared quotes with people, so if I quoted them, I went back to them and made sure that they were comfortable with the quote. And I traveled to Afghanistan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar each of those countries I traveled to at least twice during the reporting of the book, so that it's not just kind of inside the Situation Room. I always find the Bob Woodward books are kind of a bit airless because they're always just inside the Situation Room. And you don't get out to Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia or these other countries. I'm not pretending that my books are certainly any better than his, but I am saying that they're informed by time in the field that his books really aren't.
You know, it's actually interesting. I was going to ask you, not when we were sitting on the stage, I was going to ask you if you actually did check the quotes with, because a lot of the book is conversation. A lot of the book are conversations. So you actually, that's really interesting.
I went back and I checked the quotes with everybody. That was part of, every interview I did was, almost without exception, was on background. But maybe 2 or 3 were on the record. And then I went back and checked the quotes. And anyway, I can assure you, if you haven't read the book, it isn't a boring read.
You're not supposed to say that. I'm supposed to say that. Jesus.
Well, I can tell you, I know myself. I mean,
okay,
it was fun to write. I mean, if you're a writer and it's not fun to write, why would it be fun to read? And it was mostly fun to write.
Well, considering that it's about a topic that is, you know, that is grueling, you do bring it to life in a lot of very intriguing, very interesting ways, and the narrative just flows. But I want to come back to these generals, and then I have a bunch of policy questions I want to ask you.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you talk about early on that I think that people who are just sort of general readers don't quite appreciate is the kind, when you say the military, you know, the generals that are in the White House, and there was also Flynn, who I understand why you don't mention him because he's not really there, but the amount of generals in this White House was surprising, right? And yet it's not a monolith, right? And they're not. And what you do really early on is establish the fact that there were tensions, not just between the president and the generals, but among the generals themselves. And in particular, Mattis and McMaster. And I wondered if we could sort of start there with how you understood what the tension between them was about.
Well, you know, Mattis is a retired 4-star general, and when he was in a meeting, he would always refer to Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, which was his way of signaling this guy is a 3-star general and I'm of a more exalted rank. I mean, H.R. McMaster and Mattis are, you know, in some ways are very similar in the sense that they are both, you know, extremely well-read and very thoughtful guys. Both of them fought, heroically in Iraq. H.R. got a Silver Star in Iraq and was wounded. That's something I only found out in fairly long into the reporting of the book. Of course, led a campaign against Al-Qaeda in Iraq in Tal Afar in 2005. He was also a hero during the Gulf War, where he led, you know, a classic tank battle in which, in about 20 minutes, his troop destroyed 23 Iraqi tanks, which is still being taught as a kind of conventional war kind of set piece at military schools. And you know, Jim Mattis led the Marines into Baghdad in 2003. As a 2-star general. Guess who his 1-star general deputy was? It was John Kelly. Guess who was his colonel? It was Colonel Joe Fighting Dunford, who then became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So Kelly and Mattis had this, you know, they're extremely close. I mean, and so that was a very tight thing that HR was sort of excluded from. So HR began to refer to Rex Tillerson and Jim Mattis as the Club of Two, which you know, that wasn't really letting him in. And you know, that's an uncomfortable place if you're the National Security Advisor, if the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense aren't really, aren't really dealing with you. So yeah, there were tensions, and it got pretty bad. In fact, and over time, part of this was a reflection of how Jim Mattis felt about President Trump. Now, I think, and I'll get to this in a minute, I think he misunderstood Trump in some levels. But Mattis was very concerned that Trump would do something super impulsive. And he would say regularly, we have to make sure that reason trumps impulse about Trump. And what was that in action like? In action, that was when the White House asked for military options on Iran, Mattis just didn't provide them. You know? When Vice President Pence and H.R. McMaster wanted to have a war game at Camp David in the fall of 2017 to kind of discuss the options of North Korea, Mattis didn't send war planners. You can't have a war game without war planners. So it just didn't happen. So that was the way that, and over time, I think the people in the White House, including the president, began to sour on Mattis, and he's nicknamed Mad Dog Mattis. They refer to him as Little Kitten Mattis at a certain point because he was, but now getting to the point about how he kind of, I think, got Trump wrong. Turns out that Trump may be impulsive rhetorically, but I don't think in practice he's that impulsive. I mean, there are obviously some big caveats to this, but when it comes to the use of military power, he's much more similar to Obama than people give him credit for. And I think for Obama supporters and Trump supporters, that might be an uncomfortable kind of conclusion. But the fact is, if you strip away the rhetoric, both of these presidents came from outside the kind of conventional political machine. Since 1992, the United States has only elected one real kind of machine candidate, which I would say is George W. Bush. It's Bill Clinton was sort of outside the machine, Barack Obama was outside the machine, Donald Trump was outside the machine. So they're kind of outsiders. They come in, they see themselves as being elected to get out of America's endless wars. They actually do that. Obama pulls out of Iraq, does draw down in Afghanistan, and the same kind of impulse with Trump. And Trump also followed the same kind of playbook that Obama did on the fight against ISIS. It was really special operations, special forces, drones, cyber warfare. And so there's some similarities. Of course, there's some big differences, but I think in that regard, they're more similar than different.
I want to come back to the policy discussion between Mattis and McMaster.
Yeah.
One of the things you have this wonderful, portrayal of McMaster as sort of the nerdy wonk, and Mattis as somebody who knew how to schmooze. Right, you make that.
Well, certainly. I mean, I don't know.
But what about the policy? What about the policy distinctions between them?
Well, I don't think there were huge policy distinctions between the generals. The generals basically have the same view of the world. NATO is good, Putin is bad, we need to stay in Afghanistan. Basically they have the same view. What's different is HR didn't play the game of going to Mar-a-Lago and Bedminster and getting FaceTime with the president. I'm not saying Jim Mattis did either necessarily, but HR did not do that. And HR was really out in front on the question about what to do in Afghanistan. You kind of, a big chunk of the book is the very contentious disputes about what to do in Afghanistan that happened in the White House from January 2017 till August the 21st, 2017, when Trump announced his new policy. And during those disputes, HR was really out in front. He'd served for 2 years in Afghanistan running a corruption task force. He felt very strongly about the country, he had very strong views. He felt Obama had made a big mistake when he went to West Point on December 1st, 2009, announced a surge of troops, but also announced their withdrawal date in 18 months. And I was at CNN that day, and I remember CNN on the crawl, at 3 p.m. before the speech, it was about the withdrawal. It wasn't about the surge of troops, which was quite significant. So certainly that was, I think, I think we can agree that was a strange kind of message to surge and sort of announce a withdrawal at the same time. So McMaster felt very strongly about that. And in these meetings, it was really Steve Bannon versus H.R. McMaster. In many ways, Steve Bannon is the most well-read and smart America First nationalist wing of the Republican Party, and HR in many ways are the most well-read internationalist, so-called globalists, and they really had knockdown disputes in the Situation Room where there was, like a lot of, four-letter words and people sort of. I'll give you a scene in the book. So one HR comes in chairing the meeting. He's a national security advisor. It's July 2017, and he basically says, look, we've really got the A-team on this, and we've really thought hard about it, and this is like the smartest group of people who ever thought about this problem. And Bannon just interrupts him and says, and there are so many F words in here that you can just add F words to everything and basically says, that is just, as much as I hate the Democrats and every group of people in this room, on the Democrat side, on the Republican side, they were all really smart bunch of people, and they all thought they were going to be able to get this thing right, and no one has, and we put $1 trillion in there, and no one, and basically, it was a very, very contentious kind of dispute. And at one point, you recall Eric Prince was part of this mix, and he was going to produce kind of contractors that would work under the CIA, who were former special forces, and that idea was entertained, but not really seriously. And it really came down to, there was a final meeting at Camp David on August the 18th, August the 8th, 2017, in which it was the day that Bannon got fired, or fired himself. I mean, there's a great definition of a gaffe in Washington, which is telling the truth in public. And what he had done was give an interview. He was out the door, but he gave an interview to, strangely, to that editor of the American Prospect, which is kind of a lefty magazine, saying, like, basically, no one has explained to me how you can have a war in Korea without millions of people dying, which of course is true. And that was kind of the precipitating moment. So he was not at the Camp David meeting. And what the US military always does in these meetings is, they produce 3 options, basically 2 of which are basically untenable, and the middle option is the one that you're supposed to kind of select. And so withdrawal was clearly a non-option. And handing the entire mission over to the CIA, which was also on the table, was an option, but the CIA didn't want this little particular thing. And so in the middle was a long-term commitment and a small surge of 4,000 troops, which was what got adopted. But HR, I quote somebody in the book who, he took a lot of face shots to get there, and I think over time the president really just didn't particularly like him. There's a great quote in the book from Steve Bannon. He tells HR, look, when he first gets the job, he says, look, Trump is a game guy. Trump is the guy who stayed up all night partying. The exam is the next day. He basically takes your notes and kind of quickly looks at them, gets a passing grade, puts on and that's Trump. And he hates professors. He hates being managed. He hates being lectured to. And that was Bannon's advice. And of course, that was actually kind of good advice. HR didn't seem to be capable. HR continued to not deal with it's kind of a strange thing because he's a very bright guy and also a very kind of kind of a guy's guy that you would think would get on with the president, but he didn't. And over time he was forced out in April of 2018. He was the only senior official to be clapped out of the White House. Being clapped out of the White House meant the entire National Security Council staff and the White House staff kind of lined up on that private street that's between the White House and the Eisenhower Executive Building, and basically clapped him out, and people were crying. I mean, he was certainly well loved, and he also brought a lot of order and process to the White House. I mean, there's a great scene in the book when Mike Flynn, who's the National Security Advisor for the shortest time in American history, 21 days, he has a first all-staff meeting, and this is all professional civil servants, which some people refer to as the deep state, and one of them said, what does an American first foreign policy look like? And there was a sort of very long pause, and there were 200 or 300 senior civil servants waiting for an answer, and Flynn doesn't have one. I mean, and it's embarrassing. Yeah. And then he turns to Katie McFarland, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor, and sort of asks her for her. So Flynn was not he had he had a distinguished career on a certain level, but he was miscast in this role. He didn't really have an idea of what the world should be. Now, HR really had thought about it pretty carefully and came in with ideas about the Russians and the Chinese and how to organize the NSC and have a real process and kind of adopt the Brent Scowcroft model at the NSC. So, but he didn't survive with the president. He was forced out early, and the president has a kind of typical kind of I would say trajectory with people he brings on. When they come in, they're the world's greatest person. By the time they leave, there's all these denigratory tweets and.
Speaking of which.
Yeah.
One person that not like Mattis or McMaster in the way you portray him, and I was kind of intrigued, is John Kelly, who goes from being head of DHS to being chief of staff at the White House, who is extremely close, as you pointed out, to Mattis and close to Dunford. They're kind of a trio there. Yeah. And I was just curious to know what your ultimate take on John Kelly's experience was, and in terms of, was he effective? Was he really, one of the things that you talk about in the book is the expectation on some that he would just be the deputy to Mattis, but acting in the White House, which is a little unfair given that he'd been to Homeland first, but just putting it out there. And I wasn't really sure what your ultimate takeaway was on Kelly, the way you sort of come down in a very clear way about Mattis and McMaster. So I was just kind of curious.
Well, I think John Kelly is I don't think he's a particularly easy person to read. I mean, by his own account, he hated the job, and he would have taken, if Hillary Clinton had offered him the job, he would have taken it. So clearly, he felt a sense of duty. By the end, he wasn't talking to Trump. He left. I think a lot of these guys saw themselves as. Kelly gave an interesting exit interview to the LA Times. He hasn't said much in public, but he basically defined his job as kind of preventing bad things happening. And whether that was leaving NATO or, and so I think a lot of these, Rex Tillerson, Mattis, I think they all saw themselves as sort of ways, as trying to make sure the bad things didn't happen. Now, we're still in NATO, so I mean, it's not, it's certainly, they may have, Trump's rhetoric may have confused them in a certain sense. I mean, they had no reason not to take it seriously. And certainly on the NATO issue, Trump has some very strange ideas. There's a great scene in the book where Angela Merkel comes to the White House for the first time in March of 2017. Now, Trump is incensed that the Germans only spend 1% of their GDP on defense spending. By the way, there is kind of a sound reason we don't want a giant German military. But
thanks for pointing that out. Thank you.
Historically, speaking. But he's incensed that they're spending only 1% of GDP, despite the fact they have the second largest economy in NATO. And he presents her with an invoice for $600 billion about the money that she owes the United States, which is crazy because that's not the way NATO works. NATO countries all give a very small amount of money to NATO to run the thing, and then they spend money on their own defense. And there is an agreement between NATO countries that they will spend 2% or more of their defense spending or GDP on defense. Right now, only 9 countries do that of the 27 countries in NATO. When Trump came in, only 6 countries did. And Obama certainly had tried to push people to spend more. But anyway, so Merkel was she gets this invoice, she says that this is not real. But Trump treated her like she was late on her rent, and he was the landlord, and he was... But I don't think, is he willfully misunderstanding this, or does he misunderstand it, or does he choose to misunderstand? I don't know what it is, but he, on this NATO thing, a very consistent theme with, I grew up, in a way I was, I grew up in New York in the late 80s, and I arrived here when I was 20, and I remember Trump pretty well. I mean, who doesn't? And he's been very consistent about certain things, and so in 1987 he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, saying the Saudis and the Japanese are ripping us off and they're not our allies and they should pay down the federal deficit, which at the time was only $200 billion. So it would have been kind of a bargain to pay it down at that time. But so this idea that our allies are actually ripping us off is a very old one for him. And it's something that he feels strongly about. Is it kind of based in reality? I don't think so. And one thing that he never says, which I think is striking, he never acknowledges the many hundreds of British, French, and German soldiers who died in Afghanistan fighting in a war that was on our behalf as a result of 9/11. And I've never heard him once acknowledge that. It's always about people owing money, and so that's his view. Will this affect the NATO alliance in a long term? If there was another term, would that begin to add up? Maybe if there was 5 years as opposed to 1 year. But the NATO alliance obviously has been around for more than 70 years. So I'm not in the kind of school that Trump is going to change everything. And the American body politic is pretty robust. And whatever you think of Trump, the 1970s in this country were, I think, people were being killed, assassinated, shot on the streets. There was a great deal of violence around politics, and we don't have that. Obviously, we have a polarized environment. We don't have a civil war. We don't have people being beaten to death on the halls of Congress as we did, or we've had in the past. So I think if a certain amount of historical kind of modesty about the moment we're in would be, I think, not a bad idea.
Okay, except. Yeah. Except I did read the book, and one of the great things about the book is its geographical breadth in terms of dealing not just with our allies, but with the more gray area, you know, friends and foes, frenemies, whatever you want to call them. And
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about a couple of those countries. And
Yeah.
let's start with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And basically, and I guess my question is, given what you just said particularly, do you think that Trump has or has not moved the needle in terms of our relationship with Saudi Arabia?
Well, if we'd had this discussion, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the consulate in Istanbul on October the 2nd of 2018 kind of is a fulcrum around this question, because up to that point you could make a very good defense of Mohammed bin Salman that would go like this. A, he has a plan for bringing Saudi Arabia off oil. It's complicated, but he does have a plan. This Vision 2030. B, he is really, women can drive, a lot more women working. He's put the religious police back in their barracks, which they were very much feared, and they could arrest people at will. They can't do that now. He's kind of dialed back the Wahhabi ideology, which is always something that since 9/11 that we, the United States, have wanted. He's he's liberalizing in both economically and politically Saudi Arabia, but in a very, very specific way, because at the same time he's also crushing dissent ruthlessly. So if it is a paradox to us, I think, that he's allowing women to drive, yet some of the people he's imprisoned are the activists who were pushing for women to drive. And so why is that? And I think it's fairly simple. You cannot demand your rights in Saudi Arabia. You can be given them by the king, by the monarch, the absolute monarch. And so that's his kind of view of the world. So that, that's all the good stuff. The bad stuff, of course, is the invasion of Yemen, but the war in Yemen, which has created this terrible humanitarian catastrophe. He kidnapped the Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri for 2 weeks. He blockaded Qatar, which is the site of our most important base in the middle, really outside the United States, which is why Mattis was very opposed to this, which is 11,000 American servicemen and servicewomen really coordinating the war against the Taliban and ISIS. He in some way oversaw the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So the problem with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, is the Saudis needed to do something. I mean, the previous generations, it's basically a gerontocracy, and there wasn't going to be real change. And so MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, is bringing real change. But he's also, imposing a kind of Stalinist rule on the population, minus the gulags. I mean, if you're following the Stalinist playbook, you don't only imprison dissidents, you also imprison anybody who could be a power center other than in any way. And so he's got rid of all the military leaders. He's, basically imprisoned a lot of the conservative clerics. I mean, from our point of view, some of that is good. But it's creating a society that is a very nationalistic Saudi Arabia now, which is kind of using Saudi nationalism. So, MBS is a kind of complicated figure, and, they went all in with Kushner, went all in with MBS. MBS really kind of courted, both the House of Trump and the House of Saud understand family dynasties and working with sort of they felt comfortable dealing with each other, and they continue to do so. But look at how Trump has reacted to the Pensacola attack. I mean, this is the first terrorist attack by a foreign national on the United States since 9/11. I want to repeat that. This is the first successful terrorist attack by a foreign national on the United States since 9/11 by a Saudi military officer. And so, of course, 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. And, of course, none of Saudi Arabia is not on the travel ban list. And so I deal with the travel ban at some length in the book. But this was a solution in search of a problem that didn't really exist. And so Trump's reaction to that was kind of almost nonchalant. I mean, if you did the thought experiment where it was a Yemeni or a Syrian refugee, God forbid, or something like that, he would have talked about it a lot. Instead, he was just like, well, the Saudis are really sorry this happened, and then just moved on. So this kind of link, and the worst thing in life is to believe your own propaganda. And I think Trump really believes that we're doing these huge arms deals with the Saudis, and that otherwise, if we didn't do them, the Russians and the Chinese would be doing them. Well, in fact, if you look at the actual sales figures since the Riyadh trip that Trump did in May of 2017, in the first couple of years, there was only $4 billion of extra sales. Now, that's not a trivial number, but it's not $100 billion or hundreds of billions, which Trump seems to believe kind of came out of that. So, you know, I am puzzled by, in the Gulf, it seems to me the United States has a bunch of frenemies of various kinds, you know, who've acted in our interests and against our interests, and why we decided to go all in with the Saudis as opposed to the Qataris. If you look at the Qataris, you know, Trump really went along with the blockade in Qatar and sort of recited Saudi talking points, at least initially. You know, Qatar is the home of Al Jazeera. You can have your views about Al Jazeera, but it is one of the most free kind of media entity in the Gulf. It is also the home of campuses for Georgetown, Medill, Carnegie Mellon. You can't really imagine these universities opening in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, it's also home to Al Udeid Air Force Base, which is kind of this critical base to the United States. So the Qataris, on many levels, in my view, are a much more natural ally than the Saudis. But he went all in. Because we can talk policy, but I also want to talk anecdotes, because anecdotes are why people read books. I have a great scene in the book.
Just so you know, a lot of people in this audience also read for the analysis and the policy.
Okay, well, I believe that.
We also like to be entertained, but I'm just letting you know.
You can't have spinach for dessert, right? So what you need to. So one of the anecdotes is Trump is on the phone after Jamal Khashoggi is murdered with both King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, and this anecdote I think reflects quite well on Trump. And you know, he's saying to King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, you know, where's the body? The family obviously needs the body back, and you know what happened. And at one point he says to Mohammed bin Salman, look, I've been in some pretty tough negotiations. I've never taken a bone saw to one of them. And then Mohammed bin Salman says, you know, and then he says, where's the body? And then Mohammed bin Salman says, yeah, we gave it to the Syrian guy. And he said, and Trump says, well, some random Syrian just walking around Istanbul, we gave him the body. And so Trump was quite skeptical in private about this whole story. In public, obviously, he continued to defend him. At the end of this phone call, which very few people were listening to because of their concern about leaks, he said, look, at the end of the day, we're going to back you. And that, you know, that's what they've done. And Trump is kind of all in with them. And interestingly, history is sort of repeating itself a little bit here, because we're sending American troops to Saudi Arabia, which was the casus belli for Osama bin Laden, and I think had some role in why this attack played out in Pensacola.
While we're in that part of the world,
Yeah.
You know, this week the Afghanistan report came out.
Yeah.
And you've already finished and published the book. On the other hand, a lot of your book is about Afghanistan, and it's also what you've been writing about for the last 3 decades. And you know, and now we see this new policy of the drawdown, which has just been announced. Right. So my question is, first, tell us a little bit, anecdotally, if you like, about the disagreements about what would happen if we pulled out of Afghanistan or drew down in Afghanistan. And then, is there any benefit, is there any value added from the Afghanistan report? There's been a lot of criticism about how nobody's paying attention to it. It was launched as a lessons learned.
Well, look, I mean, you know Craig Whitlock, who wrote this. He's an incredibly impressive reporter. I mean, I'm sure it'll win the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, for people who know, I met my wife in Afghanistan, as you know. I was there 10 days ago. So, I mean, I've been there, visiting there since '93. Was there during the Civil War, was there during the Taliban. By the way, so with this report, obviously, is, you know, kind of disturbing on some levels, because, you know, there were certainly things that were said in private that weren't being said publicly about what was going on. But is it really news the Afghan security forces are all screwed up? Is it really news that Afghanistan has a really big drug problem? I mean, these are like, I mean, let's be real. The real, I think, one thing the report doesn't deal with, and because it isn't that story, is what has actually happened. I mean, so if you look at Afghanistan today, the Taliban peace negotiations were conducted without the input of the Afghan government, which is one of the many reasons I think it was a very bad idea, the main reason. But look at the population of Afghanistan today. 70% of it is under 30. Mm-hmm. Half the population couldn't work or be educated. 15% of the population are Shia Hazaras, who were brutally repressed by the Taliban. So if you do the math, the vast majority, there is a huge population of millennials, a huge population of women, a huge population of Shia Hazaras. None of them want the Taliban back. And the Taliban have obviously done reasonably well. They have a safe haven in Pakistan. They have money from the drug trade. So getting to your question, General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, at one point said, no one likes to pay life insurance, but you pay life insurance because it's stupid not to. And his argument meaning that leaving Afghanistan is the only thing worse than staying in Afghanistan, just precipitously leaving. And look what happened in Iraq in 2011 when Obama pulled the plug there. And that was kind of the argument that kind of won the day in the Situation Room. Now, we're back to the kind of withdrawal. I mean, the strange thing about the negotiation with the Taliban is like, why announce withdrawal of the troops if you're going to start negotiating with them again? It doesn't make a lot of sense. We're sort of losing leverage. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with negotiating with the Taliban. I think you just have to be realistic about how long these things take. So it took half a century for the Colombian government to come to an agreement with the FARC, which is not completely solved. It took 30 years for the British to come to an agreement with the IRA. A lot of it was done in secret initially, just as our negotiations with the Taliban have been, and now they're kind of quite public. So this is not going to happen tomorrow. But I think in the meantime, Afghanistan, the situation there is bad. I mean, when I was there 10 days ago, we were traveling only in armored cars because you can't, as a Westerner, you can't. Used to, you could walk. Kabul was actually one of the more fun cities in the world with great bars, restaurants, great social life. That is totally gone. The restaurants, the hotels are closed. The Taliban have mounted a very effective operation, targeting Westerners, kidnapping them, blowing up things in Kabul. So the situation is bad, but it's not 2008 Iraq. By any stretch, where 200, if you go back to 2006 in Iraq, 100 civilians were being killed a day. The population of Iraq and Afghanistan is roughly similar. In Afghanistan right now, it's about 10 to 12 civilians a day. Now that's too much, obviously, but the violence in Iraq was off the charts. In Afghanistan, it's still it is not like the country is completely collapsing because of the violence.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I guess was highlighted about Whitlock's report was how much was being said on the inside about the disasters and the mistakes and the problems of Afghanistan, and whereas the public was told that the war was going.
I hate to be cynical, but I think this is human nature. I mean, let's do the thought experiment where we just listened to all the conversations of the faculty at Fordham Law School about how screwed up things are. I'm just saying people bitch and moan privately in a way they don't say things publicly. That is just life. Yeah. I mean, there was plenty of reporting by the Special Inspector General about what things that were going wrong, and so and there were lots of journalists writing about the drug trade and the inefficiency of the Afghan security forces. So I'm not saying I think it's a good piece of work. I'm not. No,
that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, this is not the Pentagon Papers. I mean, give me a break. I mean, 50,000 Americans plus were died in Vietnam. There was the draft. There was, I think, a much more kind of concerted effort to lie at the 5 o'clock follies. This is something, it's important, but I think it's different. And the other thing is, I mean, Afghans, ultimately, the Afghan government, which is a democratically elected government, wants us to stay. It's not like we're there because we're just imposing our will. Mm-hmm. We have a status of forces agreement that was actually negotiated by the Obama administration till 2024. Mm-hmm. So we have. And I think there were a lot. I mean, when I was in Afghanistan in February, and I talked to a lot of people about the Taliban peace negotiations. And if you're the women I spoke to were all said this is a total betrayal. I mean, these are the words they used. They were very, very concerned that these negotiations were going to sell them down the river. Mm-hmm. They see the advances, and I mean, for us it looks screwed up. But can you think of a country in the world that had a Soviet occupation and a totalitarian war where 2 million people were killed and a third of the population were forced out of their houses? Then a civil war where hundreds of thousands more were killed, and then the Taliban basically destroying what remained of the economy and kind of creating this medieval society. I mean, this is that's the experience that Afghans have. So our experience is there are bombs going off in Kabul and it's bad, but their experience is this country's had 40 years of very, very serious wars. This is the last one in a series, and it's a much more contained version of what they've seen before, which I'm not defending this, I'm just saying that's their experience.
So before we go to questions, just one thing I want you to weigh in on so that people know what's in the book, and I think one of the many things in the book worth reading about, and that is Putin. And how do you see the Trump administration's evolving relationship to Putin, and to what extent, and you write about this, so I'm really just asking you to talk about the book, were these generals included or excluded from the conversations about Russia, with Russia?
Well, we know that Trump has met alone with Putin, famously in Helsinki. Mm-hmm. And Dan Coates, who was the director of national intelligence, I think surprisingly quickly came out to sort of defend the intelligence community within hours. And bear in mind that he's a very conservative Republican from Indiana, close to Vice President Pence. In one meeting about the Afghan war, Pence asked Dan Coates to lead the meeting in prayer, which is kind of a first for many of the national security officials in the Situation Room. So this is a very conservative Republican, and he really came out, I think, swinging after Helsinki to say it is our, universally held assessment that the Russians interfered in the presidential election. There is a certain irony here. President Trump came into his political career was launched on a conspiracy theory, which is that President Obama was a non-American Muslim. And his political career is being derailed by another conspiracy theory, which is that Ukraine interfered in our presidential election. And that's the danger of conspiracy theories. And his relationship to the truth is, kind of complex. So,
You mean he doesn't have a relationship to the truth, or?
Well, that's a discussion for another day. But I want to say in his defense that Trump has not made any major unforced errors. He hasn't invaded Iraq with a 150,000-man army. He hasn't. He kind of got the measure of China largely right. I think you may disagree with the tactics on trade, but certainly the kind of wishful thinking about the Chinese that as they liberalize their economy, they would liberalize their political system. Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, the inverse has happened. As they liberalize their economy, they've actually become more authoritarian. They have more resources to do it, and now they've imprisoned 1 million plus Uyghurs, and essentially these are concentration camps. Mm-hmm. They don't have. It's not a Holocaust situation, but concentration camps are what the British did with the Boers during the Boer War, which is you bring the population in and you put them in these camps and you detain them indefinitely. So that is what is happening, and I think our approach to China is a much more clear-eyed approach, and that's Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster wrote these strategies. But clearly, Trump is commander-in-chief, and he sped up the fight against ISIS. He kind of changed the rules of engagement a little bit in terms of how many troops you could have in Syria, how many helicopters. He sped up that fight. He responded to the Syrian use of chemical weapons, Assad's use of chemical weapons against his own people. So this is not a record of failure. But then,
what is the cost? The subtitle of your book is The Cost of Chaos.
Yeah, well, the cost of chaos is alliterative, and you're always looking for alliterations in titles.
No, come on. That is not an acceptable answer. Stop it.
No, I mean, I think there is a kind of consistent inconsistency that is a problem. I mean, and I think that's problematic for our enemies and our allies. And so look at our Afghan thing. And the Afghan, we're going to stay there for the long term and put it in a surge of troops. Then we're going to withdraw. Going to close the whole thing down. We're going to talk to the Taliban. Nope, we're not going to talk to the Taliban. We're going to disinvite them from Camp David. Now we're talking to the Taliban. We're withdrawing. This is a very complicated thing for Afghans to understand. What does that say to the Pakistanis? What does that say to the Afghan population? What does it say to the Afghan government? I think it's confusing. Mm-hmm. Then take our Syria policy, where in December 2018 we're going to pull out completely, leave the Kurds to the Turkish military. Then Jack Keane, who I portray as a sort of shadow national security advisor, persuades Trump to leave troops there. Then he changes his mind again and says we're going to withdraw a few months ago. Then he changes his mind again. So what is our Syria policy? It's hard, I think, for allies and for enemies. They want to know what our positions are. And I think that it doesn't really matter if the stakes are kind of low, as they probably are right now. But I think it does matter if there's a major foreign policy crisis. And I think Trump has been very lucky that he hasn't had a major foreign policy crisis. If you go back to every president since FDR, it's had some, the rise of the Nazis or the Iron Curtain coming down over Europe, or the Vietnam War, or the hostages taken in Iran for Carter, or the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets for Carter and Reagan, and then 9/11 itself for George W. Bush, the global financial crisis for Obama, and Clinton had the Al-Qaeda blowing up 2 American embassies, killing more than 200 people, and blowing up the USS Colt. These were all crises, and the presidents all reacted in various different ways. Effectively, sometimes ineffectively. Now, how will Trump react in a major foreign policy crisis? We don't know. What we do know is the group of people that he has around them are not this quite impressive group that he first had. I mean, Larry Kudlow is no Gary Cohn. Mark Esper is no Jim Mattis. Robert O'Brien, this National Security Advisor, is no H.R. McMaster. I mean, the list goes on. Mick Mulvaney is no John Kelly. So, I mean, the reason these guys are no longer working for Trump is they all disagreed with him and were prepared to have disagreements, on substance. And I think the group that he's running the White House like he ran his real estate company is sort of a one-man show with a group of yes men, small smattering of yes women, and family members. And that may work if you don't have a crisis, but in a crisis, let's see how it affects him.
Okay, time for your questions. So make sure they're questions, make them short, sweet, and to the point, so that we can take as many as possible. Let's start with this woman over here.
This is very short. Could you talk about the dynamic that we are about to go through in 2020, starting with the impeachment, the Senate trial, and then the campaign and the election?
All in 2 minutes.
Well, this is like a play that we already know the ending for the impeachment. So why go and see the play? I mean, I mean, he will not be convicted. He will be impeached, and we'll just move on. Then we'll have an election. And I think I think the worst outcome would be an impeachment and a removal from office, so close to an election. I mean, let the American people decide if they want to have him continue as their president. Half the country voted for him. He remains. We'll see. I mean, if the Democrats don't produce a viable candidate, they deserve to lose. And right now, I don't think it doesn't seem like the Democratic Party's coalesced around a really viable candidate. Will Bloomberg be that person that will appeal to independents and moderate Republicans and enough of the Democrats? Maybe. Will Joe Biden be that person? I go back to Americans don't want machine candidates, and I think Joe Biden is a machine candidate at this point. I mean, they keep rejecting people who are just kind of, it's their turn. And so anyway, look, I mean, it's outside my area of expertise, but I mean, we don't know what the answer is. If people are looking at their 401k, they're going to probably vote for Trump. Enough of them to, and if there are no major crises, it seems like the law. Right, if the election was tomorrow, he'd win. Let me put it that way.
Over here. No, we'll take two, and then.
Has the role of the administration and the U.S. in general changed vis-a-vis Pakistan with the departure of the generals?
It's a good question. Pakistan used to be front and center back, in 2009 when Obama was having a surge, and there was a lot of discussion of Pakistan. Pakistan's kind of like a little bit dropped off the charts. Right now, we have Imran Khan, the former cricketer, who's kind of essentially, supported by the military. And Pakistan, the economy is in terrible shape. But I mean, it's sort of like a non-issue. I mean, Pakistan becomes important to the United States. The greater the number of troops in Afghanistan, the more we pay attention we pay to Pakistan. So if you look at the drone strikes under Obama in 2010, there were 122 drone strikes by Obama into Pakistan. At that time, we had more than 100,000 troops. Today, we have 13,000. We're going down to 8,000 roughly. The drone strikes have almost stopped in Pakistan. So Pakistan has sort of fallen off I think has become less important to us because we just don't need them as much. I mean, how do you resupply our troops in Afghanistan? You can't do it through Iran. It's a problem to do it through China, and it's a problem to do it through the former Soviet republics in general that are on the northern. So you have to do it through Pakistan. So if we have a lot of troops there, Pakistan's important to us. If we have a smaller group of troops, it's less important. So I think that's the dynamic that we've seen.
Yeah.
Thank you. You spoke about Secretary Mattis slow walking or refusing orders to the president, and there have been other occasions of senior Pentagon officials criticizing Trump's policies. Do you think there is a serious break between the civilian control, public the public discourse between the civilian and the military, and is that something that can be put back in the bottle?
Well, do the thought experiment where President Elizabeth Warren orders something or suggests something and it doesn't get acted on. I mean, so you don't want to. At the end of the day, the commander-in-chief is a commander-in-chief, and his or her orders should be followed. Now, I have a scene in the book where Trump visits Central Command for the first time 2 weeks into the presidency, and he's there with General Votel, who runs Central Command, and Tony Thomas, who runs Special Operations Command, and a lot of other national security officials, and he's looking at a map, and at one point he says, next time these Iranian boats come out in the Straits of Hormuz, let's just blow them out of the water. Now, that's obviously not a legal order, and it wasn't acted on, and people didn't take it seriously. But certainly when it came to military options on Iran, people in the White House felt that Trump was actually asking for, in a completely legitimate way, military options that were not being provided to him, and that does raise some interesting kind of questions about the proper civil-military relations. Of course, H.R. McMaster's entire book, Dereliction of Duty, is about this very question, and it's a very fraught question in a lot of ways, because the generals in the dereliction of duty didn't give Lyndon Johnson real military advice. They just told him what he wanted to hear. So that played on, I think, H.R. McMaster. When he went into the White House for the first time, he was in the same White House as same office in the White House as Lyndon Johnson's national security advisor. And so this question about what the generals, because the generals can disagree and debate with the president, but at the end of the day, he's in charge and he's the only elected official in the room. So it's an interesting tension. They can give their best military advice, it can be ignored. But I think we certainly don't want to be in a situation where the Pentagon is not responding to legitimate orders by the duly elected commander-in-chief.
Over here.
What was the influence of the generals on Trump's instinct to engage North Korea?
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer to that question. I mean, I've already told you how Mattis slow-rolled the military options, but on the question of engagement, I just don't know. I don't have a good answer to that.
Last row up there.
Hi, Peter. I was hoping you could comment on the Trump and his generals' opinion of the 9/11 families' lawsuit against Saudi Arabia. And as an addendum to that, it's been 18 years, and as far as I know, our intelligence agencies are still being blocked by Saudi Arabia in terms of interviewing the families of the hijackers and the handlers of Midar and Al-Hamzi.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if you could just comment on that. Thank you.
Well, certainly in the background, like, why is the Aramco IPO not in New York City? I mean, the simple answer is JASTA, right? With JASTA being the congressional legislation that allows the lawsuit of the 9/11 families to move forward against entities in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis just don't want to take the risk that there'll be shareholder kind of activism, or that somehow, some large judgment might happen, and they have the Aramco IPO here. So that is happening in Saudi Arabia and maybe in Asia later. So, Saudi Arabia is one of the least transparent societies in the world. I can tell you a day in Riyadh is like a week anywhere else in the world. I mean, it's a very closed society, and Mohammed bin Salman is opening it up. It's an interesting question about, at the end of the day, the Al-Qaeda project was to overthrow the Saudi royal family. So the idea that the Saudi royal family was in some way implicated in the 9/11 attacks, I think, doesn't kind of meet the common sense test. That said, two of the hijackers, as you've indicated, the ones in San Diego, were getting help from Saudi government officials. Now, was this kind of, it's still a little unclear, was this just help because, they were being nice guys, or was it something more? And I don't want to get into that, but this is the background for the Saudis were very happy. when Trump, well, the Saudis initially, when Trump was elected, they were like, I mean, they, like the whole world, they thought Hillary was going to be elected, and she was a known quantity. So they had to kind of scramble to get in to kind of meet, to get to know the Trump team. And Jared Kushner is quoted in the book that Mohammed bin Salman rushed me like no other woman has rushed me. That like there was a kind of ardor because they and I think they're certainly concerned about this lawsuit, but it's dragged on now for 18 years, and I'm sure it'll continue.
One last question over here. Oh, and then Steve. We'll have 2 questions in a row. Don't answer the first one.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Peter, do you have a take on the Washington Post's story of late that there's essentially a new set of Pentagon papers with respect to Afghanistan and the truth not being told with respect to that history?
Wait on this.
Yeah.
And then over here.
First of all, I wanted to comment on something that you had said up there. Actually, Zacharias Moussaoui's brother has written material that is available. So although he was not an actual participant, he was an attempted participant, if that helps you at all. And Mr. Bergen, I wanted to ask, in the Taliban negotiations, if they do not go the way that the U.S. would like them to go, are there drivers that we should look for the resurgence of Islamist groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Well, I think I think our absence from the scene would kind of help drive those groups. Right now, the president, I think, has conflated something that I think has received a lot of. I think Americans have slightly conflated as well, which is there's a big difference between persistent presence and an endless war. And I think in Afghanistan, a policy of persistent presence, which is a relatively small number of special operations, special forces, Air Force trainers, which are very important, intelligence analysts, not assistant advised mission. This is not costly, relatively speaking, in blood or treasure. And it's an astonishing fact that 17 American soldiers, servicemen and women, died in the whole 5-year.
It's not my phone.
It's an ISIS duck, because I was about to talk about ISIS. In the 5-year fight against ISIS, only 17 American servicemen and women were killed. Now that's 17 too many, but 11,000 Kurds died. So, I mean, this is really one of the most successful advise and assist missions we've ever done. And that seems like a reasonable model in Afghanistan, where you're not spending huge amounts of money, you're not, the war, you're helping them fight the war, which is, after all, their war. And I think that's kind of where we're going, and I think that's a reasonable place to be.
Okay, and that is a reasonable place to end, because we like to start on time and we like to end on time. A few parting words for the year. Don't forget to read our Vital Interests, our newest publication about foreign policy, which is getting a lot of traction, so you should read it so that you can be educated about all these foreign policy things that we don't pay attention to as a country and should. I want to thank many people in the audience who have supported us this year. It's your donations that allow us to have these kinds of public events, so thank you very, very much. And we have an incredibly packed spring schedule already. So we look forward to seeing you in the spring. And join me in thanking Peter for 2 things. First, his book. But second, for saying yes finally that time when I called you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen.